The air in Louisiana in 1858 was a thick, living thing, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the cloying sweetness of sugar cane. It clung to the skin, seeped into the very fabric of existence, and often it carried secrets. But no secret was quite as profoundly unsettling, quite as fundamentally wrong, as the one discovered beneath the grand, decaying elegance of Bellish's plantation. Imagine, if you will, a child, not a ghost, not a whisper of memory, but a living, breathing human being, found not in a field, not wandering a road, but in the suffocating darkness beneath the very floorboards of a sprawling antebellum home. Alone. For how long? No one could say. What did she eat? What did she drink? How did she survive the rats, the snakes, the oppressive humidity, the sheer crushing isolation? The questions piled up like the Spanish moss on ancient oaks, each one heavier than the last, each one hinting at a deeper, more terrifying truth. This was not a tale of a child lost in the woods, or a runaway found hiding in a barn. This was a child who had, by some impossible means, made a home in the forgotten space between the earth and the foundations of a house filled with people who claimed to know every single soul on their vast property. And the most chilling question of all, the question that would keep you awake long after this story ends, is this: why had no one reported her missing? Why had no one searched for her? The very idea of it, a small silent life existing in the unseen void beneath their feet, was enough to curdle the blood, to make the grandest halls feel like the most desolate of tombs. But here is what makes this story different from every ghost story, every horror tale you have ever heard. The monster in this story does not hide in the dark. The monster sits at the dinner table, passes the butter with steady hands, and smiles. This is a discovery that would unravel more than just a mystery. It would unravel the very fabric of what the Vauquelin family believed they knew about their world and about themselves. It was a testament to the most brutal truth of all, that sometimes the most profound horrors are not those that scream, but those that simply exist, quietly, in the forgotten corners of human indifference. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear gets so much darker before it gets anywhere close to light. Bellish's plantation was not merely a collection of buildings. It was an empire carved from the fertile, unforgiving soil of Louisiana. Situated on the western bank of the mighty Mississippi, roughly 40 miles south of Baton Rouge, its sprawling fields of sugar cane stretched for miles, a verdant, whispering sea under the relentless summer sun. The main house, a grand two-story structure with wide verandas and towering white columns, had once been the epitome of French Creole elegance. Now, in 1858, a subtle decay had begun to set in. A faint peeling of paint here, a slight tilt to a shutter there, a persistent dampness in the air that even the strongest breezes from the river could not quite dispel. The scent of molasses, thick and sweet from the nearby sugar mill, mingled with the earthy aroma of the river, and the faint metallic tang of the cane fields, creating a unique, almost intoxicating perfume that defined Bellish's. Beautiful from a distance, suffocating up close. Armand Vauquelin, the master of Bellish's, was a man in his early 50s, his lineage tracing back to the earliest French settlers of the territory. His features were sharp, his eyes a pale, calculating blue that seemed to miss nothing, yet revealed even less. He moved with a quiet, almost predatory grace, his mind perpetually occupied with ledgers, crop yields, and the intricate, often brutal mathematics of his enterprise. He was respected in the parish, a man of order and tradition, his word as solid as the cypress timbers of his house. But there was a coldness to Armand, an emotional distance that kept even his closest associates at arm's length. He saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities, and human lives, particularly those under his dominion, were often categorized in the latter column. He did not see people. He saw numbers. His wife, Adelaide Vauquelin, was a stark contrast. Born into a prominent family in South Carolina, she had been raised with a delicate sensibility, educated in literature and music, and imbued with a quiet, almost fragile piety. The opulence of Belicia's, the sheer scale of its operations, and the inherent brutality of the system upon which it was built had always sat uneasily with her. Her days were spent managing the household, overseeing the domestic staff, and tending to her small, meticulously kept rose garden, a splash of vibrant color against the muted greens and browns of the plantation. She was a woman of deep, unspoken anxieties. Her discomfort with her world manifested in a perpetual, almost ethereal pallor, and a tendency to retreat into the quiet solitude of her own thoughts. She yearned for a different life, a different time, but the currents of her existence were too strong to fight. So she tended her roses, and she looked away, and she told herself that looking away was not the same as knowing. She was wrong. Nettie, an enslaved woman in her early 30s, moved through the grand house with an almost invisible efficiency. Her skin was the color of rich earth, her eyes dark and intelligent, missing nothing that transpired within the Vauquelin household. She was Armand's personal attendant and Adelaide's most trusted domestic, a position that afforded her a unique, if profoundly precarious, vantage point. She knew the rhythms of the house, the unspoken tensions, the subtle shifts in mood that presaged trouble. Nettie was a woman of quiet strength, her observations sharp, her counsel, when sought, delivered with a wisdom born of necessity and survival. She was trusted, yes. But in that world, trust was a fragile commodity, always conditional, always shadowed by the ever-present threat of arbitrary power. She trusted no one entirely, and she was right not to. Beyond the main house, stretching into the shimmering heat, lay the quarters of the enslaved community. Hundreds of souls toiled in the cane fields, their lives dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, the demands of the crop, and the whims of their masters. It was a world within a world, a vibrant, resilient culture forged in hardship, with its own language, its own customs, its own hidden knowledge passed down through generations. Whispers traveled faster than any horse in that world, and secrets were guarded with a fierce, collective loyalty that no master could ever fully understand or break. Deputy Sheriff Tabido was the local law, a man in his 40s with a perpetually wary expression. He was not overtly cruel, but he was a man of his time and place, deeply committed to maintaining the established order. His pragmatism often bordered on indifference, and his investigations rarely extended beyond the most superficial inquiries, if they threatened to disrupt the delicate balance of power in the parish. He preferred quiet resolutions, especially when those quiet resolutions required turning a blind eye to uncomfortable truths. He was the kind of man who told himself he was just doing his job, while the job itself was the problem. And then there was Reverend Fenn, an itinerant Methodist preacher in his 60s, a familiar if somewhat eccentric figure at Belicia's. He visited the plantation quarterly, holding services for both the Vauquelin family and the enslaved community, his sermons a blend of fire and brimstone and quiet, compassionate counsel. He was a man of genuine faith, his eyes often holding a sadness that spoke of a deep understanding of human suffering. He saw more than most, he remembered more than most. And unlike most, he could not simply look away. Remember his name. Because when everyone else chose silence, Reverend Fenn chose something else entirely. But that comes later. 4 months before the strange discovery, a young girl named Celeste, an enslaved child of approximately 7 or 8 years old, had gone missing from Belicia's. Her disappearance had been handled with a chilling, almost mechanical lack of urgency. Armin had simply noted it in his ledger as a loss. A minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of his operations. One line, a name, a date, a financial adjustment. As if a child's existence could be summarized in a column of figures. Adelaide had expressed a fleeting concern, a quiet prayer offered up in the dim light of her bedroom. But the demands of her life quickly overshadowed the memory of a child she barely knew. She told herself she did not know the details. She told herself it was not her place. She tended her roses. Among the enslaved community, however, Celeste's absence was a gaping wound that refused to close. Whispers had circulated, urgent and frightened. Sold south, some said. A common and devastating fate for children whose parents were deemed troublesome, or whose labor was no longer considered profitable enough to justify their presence. Others spoke of a more sinister end, a quiet disappearance into the vast, indifferent landscape, swallowed without trace, without witness, without justice. But no one had truly searched. No official report had been filed beyond Armin's cold ledger entry. Celeste had simply vanished, leaving behind only a lingering sense of unease, a shadow that stretched across the sun-drenched fields of Belishes, and a grief in the hearts of those who loved her that no amount of cane harvest could drown out. And then the sounds began. Faint at first, easily dismissed. The scuttling of rats, perhaps, the settling of old timbers, but they grew, slowly, persistently, until they became undeniable. A rhythmic scratching. A soft, almost melodic hum, emanating from the very earth beneath the house. A sound that promised, in the way that only certain sounds can promise, to shatter the fragile peace of Belishes forever. It was Nettie who first noticed it, while polishing the silver in the dining room one stifling afternoon. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching, rhythmic and insistent, like tiny claws dragging across rough wood, or perhaps something smaller, something more deliberate, burrowing in the darkness below. She stood still, head tilted, listening. The sound stopped. She told herself it was nothing. But as the days bled into a week, the scratching grew more distinct, more deliberate. It was no longer random. It had a pattern, a soft, almost rhythmic cadence, sometimes accompanied by a faint, high-pitched hum, like a child's lullaby sung through a thick blanket, low and sweet and deeply, profoundly wrong. Nettie mentioned it to Adelaide, her voice carefully, painstakingly neutral. "Mistress, there's a peculiar sound beneath the house near the dining room. Been hearing it for days now." Adelaide, preoccupied with a wilting rose bush, waved a dismissive hand. "Likely just field mice, Nettie. The heat brings them in. Have one of the boys set traps." Armin, when informed, merely grunted, his eyes still fixed on a column of figures. "Nonsense. The foundations are solid. It is the wind, woman, or your imagination." He had no patience for such trivialities, especially when sugar prices were fluctuating. But the sounds persisted, growing bolder, more insistent. At night, in the oppressive stillness of the house, they became impossible to ignore. Adelaide, usually a sound sleeper, found herself lying awake in the thick darkness, straining to hear, her heart quickening with each faint scratch, each ghostly hum. It was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, a persistent, unsettling vibration that seemed to emanate from the very core of the earth beneath her home. She imagined things, dark, slithering things, burrowing deeper, closer. Finally, after nearly 10 days of this auditory torment, Adelaide confronted Armin with a rare, desperate flash of determination. "Armin, I cannot sleep. There is something beneath the house. It is not mice. It is different." Her voice was thin, frayed with exhaustion and a fear she could not quite name. Armin, annoyed by her persistence, sighed dramatically. "Very well, Adelaide. I will investigate this phantom menace myself. But I warn you, If it is merely a family of opossums, I shall expect you to apologize for disturbing my sleep. That night, a humid, moonless night, where the air hung thick and absolutely still, Armin Vauquelin descended into the crawl space beneath Bellishes. He was expecting rats. He should have been more afraid of what he actually found. The entrance to the crawl space was a small wooden hatch near the back of the house, usually covered by a heavy stone. As Armin lifted it, a wave of cool, damp air washed up over him, heavy with the scent of rich black earth, decaying vegetation, and something else. Something he could not immediately identify, something faintly animal yet not entirely unpleasant. He lowered himself into the narrow opening, lantern in hand, the flame casting dancing shadows that stretched and contorted across the ancient cypress piers supporting the house above. The crawl space was a labyrinth of darkness and dampness. The ground was a mixture of packed earth and mud, slick in places, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. Cobwebs, thick and glistening, brushed against his face. The occasional scuttling sound of unseen creatures echoed in the oppressive silence. Armin, a man of order and iron control, felt a rare tremor of unease move through him. This was the wild, untamed underbelly of his meticulously ordered world. He moved slowly, carefully, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth with each step. The lantern beam cut through the gloom, illuminating roots that snaked like ancient serpents and the rough, unfinished undersides of the floorboards above. He reached the area directly beneath the dining room, the source of the persistent sounds. He paused, holding his breath, listening, and then he heard it. Not scratching, not humming, but a faint, almost imperceptible thump, 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 like a tiny, muffled heartbeat, coming from directly beneath the floorboards, just a few feet from where he stood, still and cold in the dark. He raised the lantern. Its light pierced the deepest shadows. And there, huddled in a small, scooped-out hollow in the earth, nestled between two massive cypress piers, was a child. She was small, impossibly small. Her body was curled into a tight ball, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around herself, as if she had been holding herself together through sheer force of will. Her hair, a tangled mass of dark, matted curls, was streaked with mud and dust, obscuring much of her face. Her skin, a warm, dark complexion, was grimy beneath the glow of the lantern, but underneath the dirt it held a translucent quality, as if she had not seen true sunlight in a very, very long time. Her clothes were rags, indistinguishable in the dim light, made of coarse homespun cotton, worn through at the elbows and knees. As the lantern light fell upon her, she slowly, deliberately uncurled herself, her head lifted, and two enormous dark eyes, wide and utterly unblinking, met Armin's gaze across the darkness. They were eyes that held no fear, no surprise, no recognition, only a profound ancient stillness, reflecting the lantern light like polished obsidian. The eyes of someone who had been watching, and waiting, and surviving, long past the point where most would have given up. Around her, in the small hollow, were a few crude, handmade items. A small chipped clay cup, half buried in the earth. A piece of torn fabric, faded and worn but with a faint pattern still visible. And clutched in her small, dirt-caked hand, a tiny, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings spread as if in silent flight. She did not cry out. She did not flinch. She did not attempt to scramble away. She simply sat there, utterly silent, utterly still, her dark eyes fixed on Armin Vauquelin, a living, breathing enigma in the suffocating darkness beneath Bellishes. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the frantic pounding of Armin's own heart. He had come expecting rats. What he had found was something far more terrifying. A child, living alone in the dark, beneath his very feet, for God only knew how long. a silent testament to a truth he could not yet comprehend, but one that, deep in the coldest chamber of his calculating heart, he already feared. The morning after the discovery dawned with brutal, unyielding heat, but the air inside Belish's felt colder than a winter's night. The child, still silent, was brought into the house. Her small, dirt-caked form was a stark, almost accusatory contrast to the polished mahogany and gleaming brass of the grand interior. Nettie, her face a mask of carefully controlled emotion, gently washed the child, her hands moving with a tenderness that the situation seemed to demand. Beneath the grime, she revealed skin the color of warm honey, marred by faint scratches and insect bites, testament to months of living in the dark and the dirt. Her hair, once matted beyond recognition, was now a soft, dark cloud around a face that was surprisingly delicate, though deeply, worryingly gaunt. Her eyes, still enormous, still dark, seemed to absorb all light and reflect none of it back. They held the wisdom of someone who had seen things a child should never have to see. Adelaide, upon seeing the child in the harsh light of day, gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. The child was clearly malnourished, her limbs thin and fragile, her belly slightly distended. But it was the eyes that truly disturbed her. They held the wisdom of ages and the innocence of a creature, untouched by the ordinary warmth of human interaction. It was a combination that felt deeply, profoundly unnatural. Dr. Prout arrived an hour later, a portly man in his 50s, with a perpetually skeptical expression and a medical bag that smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale tobacco. He examined the child with clinical detachment, his fingers probing her small frame, his stethoscope pressed against her tiny chest. He noted her rapid, shallow breathing, the faint tremor in her hands, the dullness of her reflexes. Malnutrition, certainly, he pronounced, his voice gruff, and likely some form of sensory deprivation. She has been living in darkness, I would wager. Perhaps for months. He carefully, deliberately avoided speculating on how she had come to be there or why no one had noticed. His job was to diagnose the physical, not the moral. He prescribed a regimen of small, frequent meals, rich broths, and plenty of fresh water. He also suggested quiet, gentle interaction, though he doubted it would yield much. She is like a wild thing, Mrs. Vauquelin, he observed, wiping his hands on a linen cloth. Needs to be coaxed back to the world. The child, true to Dr. Prout's assessment, would not speak. She ate when food was placed before her, consuming it with a quiet, focused intensity, her eyes never leaving the face of the person who offered it. She watched everything. Her gaze followed every movement, every flicker of emotion on the faces around her, cataloging, recording, filing away. She made no sound, not a whimper, not a sigh. She simply existed, a silent observer in a world that was suddenly, bewilderingly full of light and noise and the strange, careful attention of adults who could not quite look away from her. Deputy Sheriff Tibito arrived that afternoon, his face grim. He questioned Armin, then Adelaide, his questions circling the obvious. Who is she? Where did she come from? How long was she there? Armin offered vague answers, insisting he had no idea, that she must have wandered onto the property somehow. Tibito found this explanation deeply unsatisfying. A child living beneath a house for months, unnoticed. It strained credulity far past the breaking point. He then attempted to question the child directly, kneeling before her, his voice surprisingly gentle. Little one, can you tell me your name? Where are your mama and papa? The child merely stared, her dark eyes unblinking, her silence absolute. Tibito sighed, running a hand over his tired face. This, he understood with a sinking feeling in his stomach, was going to be very, very complicated. Then came the thread that changed everything. It was Nettie. While carefully folding the child's few rags, who made the discovery that would crack open the first thin fracture in the wall of Belish's carefully maintained silence. Among the tattered remnants of what might once have been a dress, she found a small triangular piece of fabric, carefully tucked deep into a seam, as if someone had hidden it there deliberately. It was vibrant blue cotton, patterned with tiny white flowers, a distinctive, unmistakable print. Nettie recognized it instantly. Her breath hitched in her throat. She stood very still, the fabric trembling in her fingers. She had seen that fabric before. She knew exactly whose it was. It was from a dress that had belonged to Celeste. The same Celeste who had gone missing 4 months ago. The same Celeste who had been dismissed from ledger and memory, alike with a single cold notation. Nettie's hands trembled as she held the fabric, her mind racing through the implications. If this child had Celeste's dress, what did that mean? Was this Celeste? No. The child was too small, too young. Celeste had been older, perhaps 8. This child looked no older than 5, perhaps 6. But the fabric was undeniable. It was a thread, fragile yet impossibly strong, connecting the silent child beneath the floor to the vanished Celeste, and to a truth that Belish's had been desperately, systematically trying to bury. Reverend Fenn arrived at Belish's for his quarterly visit 1 week after the discovery. His worn leather Bible in hand, his eyes already holding that familiar, sorrowful gaze that seemed to see straight through the carefully maintained surfaces of the place. He greeted Armin and Adelaide, his questions about their health met with clipped, evasive answers. The atmosphere at Belish's, usually one of strained politeness, now thrummed with an almost palpable, electric tension. It was Nettie who led him to the parlor where the child sat, silent and watchful in a large armchair. The moment Reverend Fenn's eyes fell upon her, something shifted in his face. A flicker of profound recognition. Then a deep, aching sorrow that seemed to rise from somewhere very old inside him. He knelt before the child, his gnarled hand reaching out, then hesitating just short of touching her. "Little one," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he was struggling to contain. "You have Celeste's eyes." He looked up at Adelaide. His gaze was piercing, far too knowing. "This child, she reminds me so much of Celeste, the way she holds herself, the quietness." Adelaide, flustered, explained the circumstances of the discovery, omitting, of course, the piece of fabric Nettie had found. Reverend Fenn listened without interrupting, his expression growing graver with each word. He had known Celeste well. Unlike so many others, he had seen beyond her circumstances to the extraordinary mind inside them. In secret, during his quarterly visits, he had been teaching her to read and write, using passages from the Bible as their primer. Celeste had been a quick study, her small fingers tracing letters with an eager, almost desperate intensity, her mind absorbing knowledge like dry earth absorbs rain. She had been a bright, curious, dangerously perceptive spark in a world that was very deliberately designed to extinguish all such lights. Through the fragmented accounts of Nettie and others in the enslaved community, a clearer and far more disturbing picture of Celeste began to emerge. Celeste had been a child of unusual, almost uncanny perception. She had a knack for noticing things, for piecing together disparate observations into patterns that should have been invisible to a child her age. She spent much of her time in the main house, running errands, helping Nettie, and often simply watching. She had a particular, recurring fascination with the papers Armin kept in his study. She would often see him poring over ledgers, his brow furrowed, his pen scratching across the pages in that precise, controlled hand. Nettie recalled Celeste asking her once, her voice quiet and genuinely puzzled, "Nettie, why does Master Armand write so many numbers? And why do some of the numbers not match the people?" Nettie had dismissed it immediately, telling Celeste not to concern herself with Master's business, a warning born purely of fear. But Celeste had not heeded the warning. She had continued to watch, continued to piece things together. She had begun to ask questions. Quiet, innocent, sounding questions that were, in the context of Belicia's, extraordinarily dangerous. She had noticed discrepancies, small inconsistencies in the records she glimpsed, particularly concerning the movement of enslaved people and the corresponding financial entries. She had seen a specific ledger, bound in dark leather, that Armand kept locked in his desk. A ledger she had once seen him consult with a man from New Orleans, their voices low, their expressions urgent, their eyes darting to the door in a way that Celeste had noted and remembered and filed away in that sharp, watchful mind of hers. Numbers that did not match the people. A locked ledger. A man from New Orleans with urgent, secret business. A child who saw too much. And then the night Celeste disappeared. 3 other things had happened simultaneously. Events that at the time seemed entirely unrelated, but which now, in the shadow of the silent child and the piece of blue fabric, took on a chilling, unmistakable significance. First, a small but valuable silver locket belonging to Adelaide had gone missing from her dressing table. Adelaide had been distraught, accusing one of the house servants, though no one confessed, and the locket was never found. Second, a particularly fierce storm had swept through the parish that same night, bringing torrential rains and high winds, knocking out visibility and felling several ancient trees near the river. The chaos of the storm had provided perfect, natural cover for any clandestine activity that might not want to be witnessed. And third, a new overseer named Silas Croft, a man known in the parish for his brutal efficiency and his unquestioning, almost pathological loyalty to Armand, had arrived at Belicia's just days earlier, replacing the previous and significantly more lenient overseer who had suddenly, and without any public explanation, been dismissed. A missing locket, a violent storm. A ruthless new overseer who asked no questions and needed none answered. These were not coincidences. These were components of something orchestrated, something planned, something that required all 3 to happen together to work. Celeste had stumbled upon something she was never meant to see, something that Armand Vauquelin was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to keep buried. And the silent child, with Celeste's eyes and Celeste's fabric, and her tiny carved wooden bird, was the living, breathing proof of just how deep that burial went. Adelaide had been avoiding the study for weeks. But one sweltering afternoon, with Armand away in Baton Rouge, and the house staff occupied with their endless chores, she found herself standing before the closed door with a strange, almost magnetic compulsion she could not explain and could not resist. The study was exactly as Armand always left it. Meticulously organized, the air thick with old paper, leather, and pipe tobacco. Bookshelves lined the walls. The large mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, its surface clear except for a silver inkwell, a quill, and a stack of neatly bound papers. Adelaide's heart hammered as she approached. She tried the top drawer. Locked. The second. Also locked. A wave of despair. And then her gaze fell upon something small and glinting on a side table, half hidden beneath a stack of financial reports. A small, ornate silver key. Armand was meticulous about everything. He did not forget things. He did not overlook details. Which meant that key being there, visible and accessible on an afternoon when he was conveniently absent, felt less like an oversight and more like something else entirely. Something she could not name. She picked it up. It was cold in her palm. With a soft, precise click, the third drawer slid open. Inside, nestled amongst other documents, lay a single dark, leather-bound ledger. Thicker than the others, older, more worn. Adelaide pulled it out, her hands clammy, and opened it. The pages were filled with Armand's precise, elegant script, columns of figures, dates, names, but these were not names of crops or supplies. These were names of people. And next to many of them, chillingly, were dates of acquisition and disposition. She began to read, her eyes scanning the entries, her breath shortening with each line. There were records of sales, of purchases, of transfers. Standard plantation accounting, brutal in its normalcy. But then she saw entries that stopped her breathing entirely. Names, dates, and then, instead of a sale price or a new location, cryptic notations: lost to fever, runaway, presumed deceased, disappeared, no trace, and beneath these, almost always a small, nearly imperceptible financial notation: value adjusted, not a loss recorded, a gain. It was the horror of paperwork, the horror of a system so normalized, so embedded in the ordinary language of commerce, that human lives and their sudden, unexplained cessation were recorded with the same dispassionate precision as a damaged tool or a failed harvest. No screaming, no confession, just columns, just figures, just the quiet, efficient language of a man who had found a way to make people disappear and profit from the disappearing. Then her gaze fell upon a specific entry dated 4 months prior. Celeste. Next to the name, not sold to Mr. Dubois, not transferred to Evergreen Plantation. Simply disappeared. No trace. Value adjusted. And then a small, almost imperceptible symbol. A tiny, hand-drawn bird. Its wings spread, identical to the one the silent child clutched in her fist every waking moment. Adelaide's eyes darted back through the pages. There, beneath another disappeared entry, was the same small bird. And another, going back years. It was not a symbol of loss or mourning. She understood that now with a sickening, absolute certainty. It was a symbol of disposal, a quiet, efficient mark beside a life that had been erased, not sold, not moved, not lost to illness, but deliberately and permanently removed. And the value-adjusted notation was not accounting for a loss. It was recording a transaction, an untraceable one. Then, tucked into the very back of the ledger, almost hidden between the last pages and the leather back cover, she found something else entirely. A small, folded piece of paper. Not Armand's neat, controlled script. A child's crude, hesitant handwriting. And a drawing. A stick figure, small and alone, beneath a large, looming house. And in the corner of the drawing, tiny but unmistakable, was the same hand, carved wooden bird that Lily held. Celeste had been inside that study. Celeste had seen the ledger. Celeste had drawn what she found and hidden it in the only place she thought no one would think to look. And then Celeste had disappeared, with a tiny bird drawn next to her name. Adelaide did not take anything. Her hands were shaking too violently to trust herself. She carefully placed the folded drawing back in the ledger, closed the dark leather cover, returned it to the locked drawer, replaced the key beneath the financial reports, closed the study door behind her. The click of the latch was very loud in the silent house. That evening she sat at the dinner table in the soft glow of candlelight. Armand returned from Baton Rouge. He spoke of sugar prices, new machinery. He passed her the bread. His hands were steady. His eyes were calm. Adelaide took the bread, and she looked at him. Really looked at him, and she understood, with a cold, absolute, final clarity, exactly who he was. The horror was not in the screaming. It never had been. The horror was in the silence. In the ledger. In the quiet, efficient erasure of lives marked by a tiny hand-drawn bird. And in the fact that the man who drew those birds could sit across a candlelit table and talk about sugar prices without his voice shaking at all. Adelaide, in a moment of quiet inspiration, gave Lily a piece of charcoal and a sheet of paper. The child took them. Her small fingers closed around the charcoal with an almost desperate grip, like someone who has been waiting a very long time to say something and has finally been given the means to say it. And then she began to draw. She drew with the ferocity and focus of someone trying to say everything they had never been able to say out loud. Her small hand moved with a surprising, almost eerie certainty across the paper. Over the course of 2 weeks, she produced 8 drawings, each one a revelation, each one answering one question and raising 3 more. The first drawing was of a large, looming house, its columns stark and white, its windows dark and empty. Beneath the house, a small, curled figure, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding shadows. Belicious, seen from below. From the perspective of the crawl space, from the only vantage point Lily had known for months. The second depicted a woman, tall and slender, her hands outstretched, reaching or perhaps pleading. Next to her, a smaller figure, a child with dark, matted curls. Celeste, and someone who had loved her. The third was more abstract. Dark, swirling lines like a storm. Within the storm, faint outlines of falling trees and a small, terrified face peering out from behind a thick root. The night of the great storm. The night of the disappearance, seen through the eyes of a child hiding in the dark beneath the house. The fourth was chilling in its simplicity. A tall, imposing man, his face a blank oval, his hand holding a small dark object. Beside him, a smaller figure with a distinctive, cruel expression. Silas Croft, and the blank-faced man, the man without a face, was Armin Vauquelin. The fifth was a series of numbers, crudely scrawled but recognizable, followed by the small hand-drawn bird. Celeste's numbers. The discrepancies she had noticed. The financial adjustments that marked a life erased, recorded in a child's memory and reproduced through another child's hand. The sixth was perhaps the most disturbing. A small open box. Inside it, a dark, indistinct shape. Above the box, a hand dropping something into it. Around it, several small dark figures watching. Something being hidden. Something being buried. Something being disposed of. Witnessed by those who had no power to stop it and no voice to report it. The seventh drawing was of a locket. Small and silver. Adelaide recognized it immediately. Her own locket. The one that had disappeared the night Celeste vanished. The child had seen what happened to it. Had carried that knowledge in silence, in the dark, beneath the floorboards for months. And the eighth, the final drawing, was a stark and brutal image. A small figure curled beneath the floorboards of a house. But this time, above the house, a single enormous eye, wide open, watching everything. It was Lily's self-portrait, her testament, her declaration that she had been there, that she had seen, that she had survived, and that she remembered every single thing. Adelaide laid the 8 drawings out on the parlor table and stood over them for a long, still moment. These were not childish scribbles. They were testimony. They were evidence. They were the voice of a child who could not speak, speaking in the only language left to her. Armin returned that evening. He entered the parlor, expecting the usual quiet. Instead, he found Adelaide standing over the table, her face pale as bone, her eyes fixed on the drawings. He approached, his brow furrowing with annoyance. "What is this, Adelaide?" More of the child's nonsense. His voice died in his throat as his eyes landed on the images. The house seen from below. The storm. The numbers. The faceless man. The locket. And finally, the enormous watching eye. His face, usually so composed, so impenetrable, contorted into something raw and ugly. A mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Who has been filling her head with such fabrications? He roared, his voice cracking against the walls of the grand room. Adelaide met his gaze. Her eyes, usually so timid, were burning now with a quiet, fierce, irreversible resolve. She drew what she saw, Armin. What she witnessed. What you did. The confrontation was brutal. Armin denied everything. His denials grew more frantic, more desperate, as Adelaide calmly pointed to each drawing and named what it showed. He accused her of madness, of superstition, of succumbing to the dark imaginations of the enslaved community. But Adelaide held firm. Her voice was steady. Her conviction was absolute. She knew. And he knew that she knew. And for the first time in the cold, ordered history of their marriage, Armin Vauquelin had no column of figures to hide behind. Deputy Sheriff Tibito returned the next day, summoned by Armin's terse note. He found Armin pacing, flushed and wild-eyed. Adelaide sat quietly, the drawings neatly stacked beside her. Tibito looked at each image in silence. His wary eyes moved slowly from drawing to drawing. He recognized the locket. He recognized the crude depiction of Silas Croft. He recognized the numbers and understood, in his practiced, pragmatic way, what their presence in a child's drawing meant. He looked at Armin, then at Adelaide, then back at the drawings, and the silence in the room was the loudest thing any of them had ever heard. Before Tibito could speak, a carriage rumbled up the drive. Two stern-faced men in dark suits stepped out. They were from Baton Rouge, sent by Armin's powerful associates, men with a vested and considerable financial interest in ensuring that the delicate balance of power in the parish remained undisturbed. Their arrival was not a coincidence. It was a message delivered swiftly and without ambiguity. This matter was to be handled discreetly, efficiently, without scandal, without noise, without truth. But Reverend Fenn had already moved. While the household was consumed by confrontation and calculation, he had quietly taken his worn traveling coat and, with careful, precise hands, made copies of each of Lily's 8 drawings, sketching them onto sheets of paper he kept folded and sewn into the coat's lining. He knew, with a certainty that went all the way down to the bedrock of his faith, that these drawings were more than art. They were a truth that needed to be preserved, a voice that needed to survive, even if it had to wait years, decades, for a world that was finally ready to hear it. The men from Baton Rouge did their work efficiently. Deputy Sheriff Tibito's investigation was quietly, firmly closed. The official record would state that Lily was a runaway from a neighboring plantation, suffering from amnesia. That Celeste had been sold south, her whereabouts unknown. The drawings were dismissed in official language as the confused imaginings of a traumatized child. Lily was removed from Bellish's. Her destination was never officially recorded. Some whispered orphanage in New Orleans. Others said a distant relative of Adelaide's had taken her far from Louisiana. Whether she ever spoke, whether she ever found peace, whether she ever understood what her silence and her drawings had cost and accomplished, remained one of Bellish's many unanswered questions. Adelaide left within weeks. She could no longer live in the house of secrets, beneath the same roof as a man whose ledger marked human lives with tiny hand-drawn birds. She moved to a small, quiet cottage in Charleston, taking almost nothing with her. She never spoke of Bellish's again, but in her quiet years of charity work, in her tireless attention to orphaned children, there was a silent, unceasing testament to the truth she carried, the truth she had chosen to see when seeing it destroyed everything. Armin remained at Bellish's, outwardly untouched, officially unblemished, but the dissolution had begun. Slow and internal and absolute, the cold precision that had defined him eroded. He became withdrawn, haunted. His once impeccable ledgers began, occasionally, to show errors, numbers that refused to balance. He was never charged, never named in any official record, never publicly confronted. But the silence, the unspoken and unspeakable knowledge became his prison. Bellish's, his empire, became his tomb. He died a decade later, a lonely and embittered man, his fortune diminished, his legacy stained by whispers that never quite faded no matter how much time passed. Nettie left in 1863, amid the chaos of the Civil War, making her way to New Orleans, where her sharp mind and quiet strength built her a life entirely her own. She never spoke of Belishes, but the memory of Celeste and the silent child lived in her heart until her final day, and Reverend Fenn kept his promise. In 1871, dying in a small parsonage in rural Mississippi, he summoned a young seminary student named Devo to his bedside. He pressed into the young man's hands a small wooden box, worn smooth with years of careful keeping. Inside, wrapped in linen, were the copied drawings and 3 pages of Fenn's own meticulous, detailed testimony. Every event, every implication, every name, every bird. "These are not just drawings, son," Fenn whispered, his voice barely more than breath. "They are a voice, a truth that must one day be heard." Devo kept the box, guarded it, spent his life quietly advocating for memory, for justice, for the voices that had been silenced and the names that had been erased. He believed, as Fenn had believed, that truth, like water, will always find its way to the surface. It cannot be locked in a drawer. It cannot be covered by a heavy stone. It cannot be buried beneath a house forever. Belishes itself slowly succumbed to the Louisiana wilderness. The cane fields became overgrown. The verandas sagged. The columns crumbled. The grand house returned to the earth that had always been beneath it. And the crawl space, dark and damp, was never entered again. No one dared. Because in the quiet, unspoken language of the land, everyone who passed by understood that it held something that could not be disturbed. Not just earth, not just shadow, but the echoes of a silent child who had seen everything, remembered everything, and in the end, through 8 drawings made with a piece of charcoal and a sheet of paper, had said everything. She could not speak, but she was never, not for a single moment, silent. This story asks us to sit with a deeply uncomfortable truth. The most terrifying things in history were never the monsters under the bed. They were the men at the dinner table. The cold, precise hands that passed the butter. The ledgers written in elegant script. The system so normalized that human lives could be erased with a notation and a tiny hand-drawn bird, and the world would simply turn its face away and tend its roses. The child beneath the floorboards was not a ghost. She was real, and she was watching, and she remembered every single thing she saw. Some truths cannot be buried. No matter how deep you dig,